Grace, over to you.
Thank you, Jim, very much. Can you hear me? Just check.
Perfect. Yeah, yeah.
All good? Right. Jim kind of gave me two tasks. He said I could talk about the importance of studying religion. I can do that, I think. Then also why religion and global society is important and its place in a secular university. Well, to bring these together, I'm going to start off in the LSE in the 1960s. Then I shall go around the world a bit, and I shall come back to the LSE in 2021. And we'll see if we can get these things a little bit together. I arrived in the LSE in 1967, and I've always thought of the 60s as it were the peak of secular confidence. If you think of decades of moods, as it were, it seemed in the 60s we could crack everything. It was the first moon landing, and enough money, enough time, enough know-how, we could do it. Religion didn't figure too much in this narrative, but surprisingly, when I arrived at the LSE, though it was a while before I realized it, there was a remarkable cluster of scholarship on religion in the Department of Sociology, which is where I was located. David Martin was there, so was Eileen, who I know is in the room today, so was John Peel, a distinguished anthropologist, so was Susan Budd, and others. And it was only retrospectively that I realized how unusual this was and how lucky I was. I just take two remarks from David Martin, who described himself at this time as an academic deviant living by a non-existent subject. You've probably heard that. It's been much quoted in obituaries and that kind of thing in the last year or two. I think it tells you quite a bit about how he felt about the LSE at the time. The other thing I picked up from David, though I think it was rather later, I can't date this specifically, but I learned from him that it's very common that if the outcomes of whatever we're talking about are good, then religion is usually deemed to be something else. But if the outcomes are less good or a bit dodgy, it's definitely religion. So it's very much, you know, heads you win, tails I lose, or however you would say that. And this is the kind of picture that I take from the LSE some 50 years ago. It was a great time for me. Subsequently, over the decades since then, the social scientific of religion has migrated and relocated. Largely, though I am generalizing, of course, I can't fill in all the detail right now. It moved away from sociology and social science into religious studies, which was going on its own journey. I mean, that had been theology and very much the study of Christianity. That became religious studies and included other faiths in a rather different frame. And then it included different methodologies, which were partly social scientific. So you had the sociology of religion, anthropology of religion, psychology of religion, that kind of thing, embedded in a religious studies home. I've worked in one of those during my time at the Faculty of Theology in Uppsala, and I can tell you that you can do absolutely anything you like in the Faculty of Protestant Theology in a Nordic country. It doesn't hamper you whatsoever, but it does impoverish the social sciences. It also gives you different bedfellows, so you talk with different colleagues, you have a very different nexus around you, and it makes a difference. Anthropology and development studies, I think, stayed closer to their original track, so don't exaggerate in what I've been saying, but I think that has happened. I'm quite interested to now see the thing going full circle, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But in the meantime, let's think of three key dates in late 20th century well, history, if you like, or politics, global politics, and they are 1979, 1989, and 9/11, which is 2001. And the most striking thing about this, 1979, of course, is the Iranian Revolution, then the fall of Soviet Union, and then the attack on the Twin Towers, was the fact that we were all, absolutely everybody, was taken aback by what had happened. Nobody at all, as far as I can see, anticipated any of those events. Now that, I think, is quite a powerful indictment of social scientific scholarship, never mind politics and policymakers and pundits and journalism and all the rest of it. I may be exaggerating a little, but not much. And of course, they were complex events. They were not entirely motivated by religion, but I think we would have been closer to the mark had we paid more attention to religion. That's the point I want to make. It's not that they're entirely a single cause and that kind of thing. It's much, much more complicated than that. But we were not paying attention to what was going on. Then in 2009, two economist journalists, John Micklethwaite and Adrian Wooldridge, published a book called God is Back, How the Global Rise of Faith is Changing the World. In many ways, it's quite a sympathetic book. They are surprisingly sympathetic to their subject matter. But I think their title is very mistaken. God isn't back because God had never gone away. What has happened is a change in perception. We've all put on new glasses and suddenly found, instead of religion being nowhere, it's everywhere. And I think that is equally distorting. I think we've got to get back to, as it were, how it fits into real people's lives and real societies. In my view, religion is neither disappearing, the strong secularization narrative, nor resurgent. It's persistent. And we need to, as it were, catch up with this persistence and make sure we've got a complete picture of what is happening across the world. Now, we're hugely helped in this way by the Pew Foundation data sets. I expect most of you have explored their wonderful, wonderful website and how well they present it. It's the most wonderful resource, very easy to use, open access, and I've learned so much from it. Of course, it's generated by extraordinarily powerful computers. And this starts in sort of in beginning of the 21st century. And that really makes me see how far we've gone from where I started in the 1960s, when we were still pushing knitting needles into punch cards. I mean, don't underestimate this in terms of the study of religion and what is now possible because of this extraordinary power of the digital revolution and what it's given us. And the Pew Foundation tell us, their findings tell us, that more than 80% of the world's population has some sort of religious attachment or it's an important aspect of their lives as a lived, situated and constantly changing reality, which has much to do with navigating everyday life as it does with the supernatural. So I'm picking up the point that Jim made at the beginning, that lived religion, where all of you have made, is really where we're making our pitch. That was one book that I thought about a lot. Talked quite a bit to John Micklethwaite while he was doing it. And I found it extremely interesting that person who was very key in journalism as editor of The Economist was looking at these things. Now, another book that caught my eye, and here I'm still with these three dates, 79, 89, 2001, with a focus in particular on 1979. The book is called Strange Rebels, and it's by Christian Caryl, spelled C-A-R-Y-L. Again, a journalist rather than a scholar. Well, where does one end and the other begin? That's not so easy. Anyway, he earns his living as a journalist. And he looks at 1979, this is a retrospect on 1979. He looks at 4 leaders and 5 countries. The 4 leaders are Mrs. Thatcher, Deng Xiaoping, John Paul II, and the Ayatollah Khomeini, all of whom came to power pretty much in 1979. You stretch a bit on 1 or 2 of them, but that something was happening, he's saying. And his 5 countries almost match these. It's UK, China, Poland, Iran, Afghanistan. What he does, which I think is extremely interesting, is a bit like Chris has said, you're trying to make one narrative rather than 5. In all of them, well, in 2 of them, in fact, it's the strong, it's the free market. That's Mrs. Thatcher and Deng Xiaoping. And in the other 3, it's increasingly visible religion. And you find the key blocks of the 20th century, the strong state and the commitment to secularism, are beginning to cede the place to something new. Something was happening in 79. And none of us saw it coming. Why not? He has the benefit of hindsight. That always makes it easier. But I think the absence of attention to religion in the late 20th century is deeply striking, and even more so as we look back. Now, we have rather jolted to something new, and this is where I think it is important to concentrate on persistence rather than resurgence, because I think that distorts again. But it is coming back now into academia, including the social sciences. I noticed it most in IR area studies, political science, political theory. I mean, interestingly, I wasn't replaced in sociology when I retired in Exeter, but there are several posts now in political science and in IR political science, which are doing things quite close to what I was doing, but only with a slightly different framing. I think it's also coming now in sociology just a little bit later. The other point that I want to pick up is, I think particularly apposite for the Faith Centre, is the changing nature of chaplaincy in academia. Again, this was very much dominated by Christian chaplaincy in the post-war period in the 1950s and 60s. That's what you assumed was going to happen. You made a kind of stretch to include care for Jewish students, but not much further. Whereas now it's become increasingly multi-faith and increasingly central to the well-being aspects of university life. It is, I think, inching into recruitment and thus marketing in the modern university. Now that's quite a change. LSE is a very good example because its students are far more religiously aware than its faculty. And that's happening across many universities. That's not something we anticipated. And as Chris said, I think the Faith Centre is very unique in bringing these things together. Chaplaincy and the pastoral care that goes with it, the encouragement of interfaith dialogue and of all sorts of groups of people who use the Faith Centre and come together in it, the leadership programs that have arisen out of that, both within the school and beyond it, and now, very logically, the growing research arm in the form of RGS, which in a way furnishes the content of some of this. As far as I know, the combination is unique, but I think it's very interesting to think about. And it's very much 21st century. It could not have happened at an earlier stage. And my last point is a sort of PS in a way. I'm now retired 10 years, so I don't have to do this, but there's an awful lot of talk in Exeter, not everywhere, I'm sure, about decolonizing the curriculum and the research agenda and research method. And there's huge thought going on about how do we get away from our taken for grantedness of what we were doing for many decades. Is this going to include paying greater attention to religion? I have been in fora where you have paid great attention to the developing world and still managed to exclude religion. It doesn't necessarily follow. I've been worked with groups of scholars who bend over backwards to include their developing world colleagues, but they don't always listen to the religious aspects of their narratives. Somehow they bracket that one out. I hope that doesn't happen. Put differently, we must cease to assume that moderately secular Europe, or the West, is the leading global region. And what Europe does today, everybody else will do tomorrow. That isn't the case. But we've got to sort of, there's a subtlety here. And here I go back to John Peel, who I mentioned right at the beginning. One of the things that stands out in my mind that John Peel wrote was that when he was working on the Yoruba, he quoted somebody he knew or had interviewed who said, "The day I became a Christian, I became modern." And I've never forgotten that. That really stuck in my mind as to how it looked. Now, if we're really going to decolonize, are we going to take that into account as well? I like Shmuel Eisenstadt's multiple modernities that Jim mentioned earlier, the fact that modern does not mean secular. It might, but it might not. I much prefer multiple modernities to any posts or lates, because we're way past post now. We must be in post. You know, that's just not going to work. We've got to think differently about how we deal with this progression, this evolution that's going to continue. But my key question is this: is Europe secular because it is modern, or is Europe secular because it is European? The way you answer that question will take you in very different directions. But I really look forward to seeing how both the RGS, the projects, Mamet's and Chris's work, and Jim's oversight is going to hold this together in something that I think is rather unique in academia in this country. I wish you all very well.